I want to bring in Tom Ridge now. He, of course, is the former governor of Pennsylvania and was the first Secretary of Homeland Security. Pleasure to have you here.
Join you and your
Ann Curry also talked to the Libyan president, who insisted that what happened in Benghazi was a terrorist attack. Let me play that.
What is your evidence that it was a pre-planned act of terrorism?
Number one is choosing the date, 11th of September. It has all the significance. If we take the facts about the way it was executed, you can see there is enough proof that it is a pre-planned act of terrorism.
Help us to understand the importance of this phrase, act of terrorism, and why do you think the president won't say that, even though some members of his team, including his spokesman, have?
Well, you know, you've asked me a great question to read into President Obama's mind and explain to you why he doesn't do certain things, and that's above my pay grade. I do think it's...
Does it send, though, a particular message? Is it...
Well, but I think there's some history here. You know, early on in the administration, President Obama was very reluctant just to use the word terrorism, and so was the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. There were man-made events. We had the Attorney General talking about treating them as criminals, and so there's been an effort, I think, within the administration to try to stay away from that term. And frankly, if you're talking the Stevens family and the other three families, they're deceased, and we can play the rhetorical game, but it looks pretty clear that it was an act of terrorism. And if you're going to, and of course the administration story has been changing over the past week or so, but the Libyan official, boots on the ground, has said it was a terrorist act, and you don't normally show up with RPGs and grenades and other things if it's simply going to be a peaceful demonstration. It certainly does look like it was prearranged. Who's responsible for it, we don't know yet, but undoubtedly we'll find out.
It's clear now, and I think to the surprise of a lot of people, that these have become part of the dialogue in this presidential campaign. And one of the things that the Libyan president also said to Ann Curry was that it looks to be some branch of al-Qaeda. That was something we frankly heard within 24, 48 hours after the Benghazi attack happened. Where do you think we are now in terms of terrorism? Obviously, as the president said, the traditional al-Qaeda as we know it seems to have been decimated. Top leaders, including Osama bin Laden, are gone. But where are we in terms of the threat of terror?
Well, I think that's, again, a misstatement from the administration. Traditional Al-Qaeda is Al-Qaeda. There's mutant forms. There's a lot of wannabes and look-alike, but basically they embrace a jihadist point of view, and acts of terrorism directed toward the West are part of their ideology and part of their action plan. So I think active terrorism, in spite of the fact that the president rightly is given some credit for eliminating Osama bin Laden, it's a misnomer and somewhat naive to think because merely you cut the head of the organization, Zawahiri has ascended to it, and now you have other groups affiliated, oftentimes just rhetorically affiliated, but others probably getting guidance from al-Qaeda groups around, not just from Zawahiri, but al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It's a dominant force in the region, and in cahoots perhaps from time to time with the Iranian influence in the region as well. So we're going to be dealing with active terrorism, al-Qaeda, wannabes, and lookalikes for the foreseeable future in that part of the world, in the balance of the world as well.
And again, you know, since I asked you to channel President Obama, I'm going to ask you to play chameleon again. You know, this is a question that people are thinking about again,
Sure.
I think in a way that they haven't in a while. If you were a moderator at one of these debates, what do you think is the central question that you would want to ask both of these candidates about where we stand in terms of our security, our battle against terrorism?
Well, you know, I think there's a tendency to just focus on al-Qaeda, and as I said before, there are a lot of mutant forms of jihadist terrorism out there, but I think the central question in this region and around the world is Iran. I mean, there are other terrorist organizations that are involved in advancing their interest through violent acts, interest in acts that are inimical to the United States and our allies. You got the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, you got Hamas, you got Hezbollah, you got Iran supporting the Syrian government. So I think one of the bigger questions, rather than al-Qaeda, is what we're going to do about Iran. And I think, unfortunately, I think here's where the president is somewhat vulnerable. Sanctions really have never really worked long term, maybe with apartheid in South Africa. Certainly we want to avoid military action. The tug-of-war between Netanyahu and President Obama continues. But when they had an uprising in 2009, massive demonstration, and there was a group called the MEK. Many of them were taken off the streets, tortured, and murdered. There's a legitimate democratic opposition in Iran, and we recognize it across the Middle East. We've never recognized it in Iran. I think that's the question that should be asked.
Well, we want to mention that you and a group of, well, there may be thousands of people, but bipartisan politicians will be out at the UN where
Right.
Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is going to be speaking today. Let me bring back in our panelists. How much is this going to resonate? What is the foreign policy question do we know that may rise to the top or that's going to be critical as people are considering who to vote for president? Could it change the equation in some way?
I think it could. I think what most Americans are probably dealing or thinking about is just, hey, it's our embassies under attack. It's a pretty visceral thing to notice there, and it's you're right. I mean, this has become foreign policy is more of a issue in this election than it was in 2008, which is something that very few people would have predicted going into 2008 for sure. So it's unpredictable with the Arab Spring or whatever you're going to call it right now. It's a very fluid dynamic, and Obama gave a speech at the UN yesterday, which was interesting and I think ultimately pretty incoherent. I mean, he kept saying we're not going to determine the democratic outcomes of what's happening there, and at the same time the Syrian leader must step down, and a nuclear weapon for Iran is intolerable. You know, I think both parties have a pretty incoherent position about the projection of U.S. power in that world, and that's going to make things pretty dynamic for a long time.
Is it unclear what both sides are going to do, and is that something the debates can help sort of ferret out?
Well, I mean, I think it's an important thing, and I think it has been too little of a debate foreign policy in this election. I think I have to disagree slightly with Matt. This is primarily a domestic policy election. The majority of the electorate is not really thinking of these concerns primarily, right? They're primarily voting on domestic issues. I think in 2004, this would have been a much more resonant debate, but you now have a country exhausted by the notion of war. We've now fought 2 wars based on this war on terror. I think people are exhausted with the idea, and I think that Mitt Romney has made such a hash of his first sort of foreign policy debut when it comes to his tour going over to Europe, and the first 24 hours of the Libya situation, I think, were so badly mismanaged and really didn't place him on an equal footing as a statesman with the president. And then the president has a record. What has been done to al-Qaeda, getting Osama bin Laden, the end of 3 major dictatorships in North Africa, I think stands him in pretty good stead, even if his numbers slip a little bit on this concern.
We're just about out of time. I want to get back to the governor really quickly and just ask you what you want to accomplish today, you and the other bipartisan politicians and protesters.
Well, I think we're now, we want to thank Secretary Clinton for taking the MEK off the terrorist list. I'm sure she did it over the opposition to some people in the State Department, but all of us, Republicans and Democrats, elected officials, diplomats, military people, have felt that it's never been on the list in the first place, and we want to thank her for doing that. But this, again, the alternative to military action in Iran and the alternative to sanctions is supporting democratic opposition. The MEK is, we think, probably the largest and best organized, but I'm sure there are other Democrats, small d, in Iran that we want to recognize. And our goal today is to have the UN take a look at the MEK at Camp Liberty and call it a refugee camp so they are protected by the UN and away from the Maliki influence. I think the Maliki government's gone in there on 2 occasions and killed over 40 people, defenseless people who surrendered their arms to our military back in the 2004. We want to encourage our European allies to resettle these individuals, and then we want to talk about regime change. If you want to avoid a war, and if you read that sanctions aren't working, then let's start supporting publicly the Democrat opposition. Take a look at all those countries in the Middle East. We've never spoken out as aggressively in support of the Democrat opposition there. It's time we start.
Governor Ridge, good to have you on the program. Thank you so much. We'll be watching later today. Thank you, Joyanne and Matt. We appreciate it.